Welcome to The Brown Box, a podcast that celebrates the lives of brown women here in Singapore. Today's guest is Ruby Jayaseelan. If you ask Ruby what she does for a living, she will tell you that she is an interdisciplinary movement artist. But to be honest, that phrase just doesn't do justice to her craft. It also doesn't give you any indication of the meandering, often very hard path that she had to take to get here. You know those people that make you think that anything is possible, that you can do anything? Well, that's Ruby. She's someone who looks at boundaries, at boxes, and dismisses them, pushes them, reimagines them. Hers is a journey of great loss and great resilience. It's a journey to take a hardened heart and soften it. It's the journey to discover a childhood that she never had, and as an adult, learn how to play. And woven through like a shining thread runs the unmistakable desire to always be unique, to always be herself. This is Ruby Jayaseelan's story. Let's dive in. Ruby and I have been messaging back and forth for a while, and when we finally found a date to meet, I was beyond thrilled when she suggested a little curry puff spot on Joo Chiat Road, because honestly, curry puffs are my weakness. When I arrive, Ruby is already waiting for me. She's small in stature, but big in presence. Her smile is wide, her hair a mass of uncontrolled curls, and she's wearing beautiful, colorful patchwork pants. You know, the kind made from mismatched fabrics stitched together, pieces that shouldn't go together but strangely do. I remember these pants because as I edit this episode, I keep thinking of them. They feel like a reflection of her life. Vibrant, layered, a coming together of experiences, approaches that should not have any logical ending, but somehow create the powerful, beautiful, successful artist that she is today. I start by asking Ruby to introduce herself. I know, as the host that's supposed to be my job, but honestly, defining the kind of artist she is feels almost impossible.
I am Ruby Jayaseelan, and I'm a movement artist. What I do overlaps in different fields, but it always comes from movement in the body. I would say I started with dance, Bharatanatyam specifically, and then that led me to movement alongside yoga as well, which starts off at the body level, the asana level, and then it drives me to different places. So often I think my practice comes from quite formal training, more codified practices. But in my doing them, in my practice of them, I allow them to evolve and let them go to creative spaces.
I asked Ruby what movement means to her, physically, emotionally, spiritually.
It's so many things because I feel like even when we're sitting here, and even if I weren't talking now, that would still be movement because innately you breathe, you live, and that is movement already. And when you put that on the same level as aesthetic dancing or technical dancing, then everything becomes movement, and it's such a wide spectrum. A lot of the practices that I've been involved in, like besides Bharatanatyam, yoga, there's Odissi, Wayang Wong, like different forms from around the region, but they often were very rigid and traditional in their practice. And I like that rigidity and that falling in, but I don't like to stay in that. I like it to evolve into something, but I do think it comes from these traditional practices and they hold a lot of power, but it's a kind of reclamation process that happens where you're taught to do this thing and you're pushing that into your body. But now how will the body find its way to reclaim this and find a way to practice it in a way that fulfills what you need now and what your body needs now?
This breaking away from traditional techniques and finding personal expression is something we will hear more of from Ruby, and seems to shape not only her approach to dance, but also her broader outlook on life. My curiosity shifts at this point. I want to know how the dancer in Ruby was born.
I think when I was maybe kindergarten, I was quite young, so 5, 6, I had a performance in school that was like a dance performance, like a hula dance performance, where we had to make our own skirts with raffia strings and all that. But for some reason, I lied to my house and wanted to apparently be in this other theater performance, which was of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And I said that I was like dopey in that. And it wasn't even conscious, this lie, until the absolute day when my sister brought me to school and she said to someone, oh, she's in this performance. And then I said, oh, no, actually, I'm in the dance one. But it was weird because I only realized this when I was older that why did I lie about that? And I liked the dance too, but I guess I really wanted to be dopey too because I remember practicing for it at home, like these fake practices.
As I edit this section and listen to Ruby's story a few more times, this anecdote takes on a deeper meaning. Here was a child who showed an instinct to take on and explore roles and narratives, even if they weren't given to her or hers to claim. To say, I'm dopey, and even do fake practices. This shows an instinct to explore, an early openness, a willingness to try. This was the birth of the boundary-pushing, genre-shifting dancer that Ruby is today. As she says,
yeah, so some of my earlier memories had some kind of distortion like this, where I wasn't quite sure what I was into, but I was really into performing arts and art in general, to a point where I would lie about it.
Ruby might have been torn between playing a girl with a pretty hula skirt and a dopey dwarf. But when she encountered Bharatnatyam, the connection was immediate and unmistakable.
I think when I saw Bharatanatyam, like from the outside being performed, I felt an immediate connection almost. Oh, yeah, I think I need to learn this. And it wasn't with ideas of performing or anything. It was just like, what is that? They're making rhythms with their feet. It just seemed awesome. And that's why I think at primary 4, at 10, my parents sent me to a Bharatanatyam class. They could afford it at that time. It was like a disciplined class, and I was not a disciplined kid. So it really was quite a challenge, and it was quite an exciting challenge. Can you do this? Can you stay still if they ask you to? It's not about whether you want to, but can you? So that was an interesting challenge, but I couldn't continue with classes because of like financial difficulties. But I think I already knew at that point that, okay, I'll go get this someday. When I have the access to it, I will find it someday. Yeah. So I think there was always a bit of a pull towards that. And traditional art forms in general seemed just really interesting because of that rigidity. It just felt like the challenge that my personality needed. As a child, I think dance wasn't like, oh, I'm having fun, let me express. It was more like about the discipline and what do we learn from these things in the body. It was already very much in that kind of academic way that I viewed dance compared to joyous and expressive. I think I was very free as a child and I was allowed to be so free. So it was just interesting that I wanted to willfully go into these spaces because it was just so different from what I knew life to be. So in those spaces, someone asks you to just fall into that. It felt like spiritual.
What makes a young child seek discipline? Ask for it. I can't speak for Ruby, but I know that at 13, after my mother passed away, I became a complete certified nerd, waking up at 5 a.m. to study for exams, taking on every extracurricular activity possible, topping my class, becoming school captain, basically searching for the things that I could control in my otherwise chaotic world. Ruby's story is, well, her story, not mine, of course, but I wonder, could there be a thread that connects us? A shared human instinct to find stability when life feels unsteady.
There's a bigger thing. It's beyond me and my body and whether I want to or not want to. It was just maybe a world so different from mine that it felt interesting.
I want to know more about Ruby's childhood. We are both Tamilian, And the cliche, in my case true, of South Indian families is that practicality trumps creativity. So engineer, techie, teacher were more encouraged than artist, dancer, or in my case, filmmaker. Was she encouraged to be creative, or was this an act of rebellion? Did someone give her permission, or did she grant that permission to herself?
My dad was really creative. He was one of those people who didn't really train, but just did things. He just drew and they were stunning. And he was always pursuing creative journeys all the time until he got a bit too taken by his alcoholism. And then he didn't. He just was a creative person and would not censor himself for me or anyone else. So I always grew up hearing him speak about beauty or like speaking about how something that's wrong is what he finds attractive, like a woman with teeth that is crooked. And then he would say something like, oh, it's so charming, that little quirk. You grow up and you hear these things. So I did think he was a big force of just pulling in creativity into my life, like just viewing things in a different perspective, and also with that holistic nature, because it wasn't like he was a professional artist, or it was really just for himself, and it just felt like that's how he lived, which I think now is my pursuit as well, to do it that way. So I think he was a big creative force, and also like my whole family encouraged me to be creative, and they saw that this is what I was interested in. But yeah, I got really lucky and really a lot of great things coming from the family. We had a lot of difficulties, but there was a lot of love too. I felt very supported to be courageous since young. I felt like I didn't understand what fear was until a much later time in my life. Because it felt, yeah, just go, do. What's the worst that can happen? You fall. Yeah, I will fall. And then we'll continue.
You fall and then you continue. What beautiful advice to receive when you're young and creative. Also, finding beauty in crooked teeth, pursuing art for the sake of it, not just to make a living. These are such beautiful thoughts.
And with dance as well, I think like when I do get into something, I do get quite obsessive about it, like a lot of us. And so when I was that way with dance, they were really encouraging, and I don't think they cared whether I chose to do it as a profession or as a hobby. I think they were just like, yeah, do it. And I just wanted to do it so much, and they were just like, yeah, go ahead. And they let me do professional theater dance things at a very young age without even knowing much. They just trusted that I would know what spaces to take up. And that was the kind of freedom that really let me go on the journey that I needed to at that time, because it's not like it has been a straight journey. It's a lot of meandering, which I really like, that the path has been this way.
I want to jump back to the beginning of that path. Origin stories, especially of the Indian diaspora, really fascinate me. I always find myself asking, why do people choose to leave their country? What do they sacrifice? What do they gain? What are the things that root them to home? What do they hold on to? And what are the things that just slip away?
I'm like a fourth generation Singaporean, so I feel like there's a lot of things that are very Tamilian or Indian culturally, and then there are some things that are just absolutely not. There are so many things like in daily living, like food and ways of cleansing the space and playing bhajans in the radio, stuff like that. It's just daily life. It's not a thing you think about. There's a Kanda Shashti Kavasam, which my grandmother taught me when I was young. It's a long song, right? But I loved it so much. I just found it like so fun to sing that I would sit in the prayer room and just sing it. It wasn't that I was so spiritual or so pious. It really is because I liked that song so much, and she had taught it to me. And so even now, I just sing it as like a practice while doing something, while doing the laundry. I feel like those things are very integrated in my life, like the Indianness or the Tamilness in my life. But it's hard for me to even point it out because it has become such a part of nature. And then there are some very obvious rejections of, this part of the culture. I think I'm good. Thank you very much. But not this, not for me. And those are maybe bigger things in life, like even ideas of marriage, for example, and how it was perceived in our culture. And so I remember my mom telling me when I was really young that don't marry, always be independent, don't ever depend. If you have a partner at some point, just still be independent.
As I edit this, I remember that at this point in the conversation, I hesitated. Ruby has mentioned financial struggles, alcoholism, and now a very strong statement about her mother and marriage. Do I ask her to share more? Is that too intrusive? I recall thinking of the power of shared experiences. You know, when you hear something and say, yes, I've been through that too. And for a moment you feel less alone. And I remember that I kept this in mind and I took a chance and gently asked for more information, really hoping that Ruby would feel safe enough to share, and also hoping that what she shared might reach someone who really needs it.
They, as in my dad and mom, had a very, very deep love for each other. They stayed with each other throughout their lives. They would have done that with or without us, even though they may think that it is us. I feel like they were very connected. And my dad was always an alcoholic and she was always holding space for him. So they were very deeply in love, I would say, even in our worst moments. But there was a person who was addicted and there was an enabler in many ways. There was also a person who supported in many ways, but at the end of the day, it wasn't a very equal relationship because one person has to pick up a lot more than the other. And I think at that point in her life, she didn't feel like this was very resourceful to be in this marriage. And when she told me that too, I was like, I took it really, yeah, of course. Are you kidding? Look at the marriage. No, because I love my dad so much. And especially as a child, we were very connected, very bonded. But I also could not be okay with his addiction and what comes with addiction and how that was affecting my mom or the family. I always felt like, yeah, of course, it's not cool. Of course, you'd rather be independent. As I grew older, I feel like I do have an issue with the requirements and the more systemic parts of marriage. But innately, of course, I believe in people being together to share their lives together, but maybe not in this kind of rigid ways that people expect it to be.
Ruby continues, sharing how she pursued a diploma in hospitality and tourism, of all things, choosing a practical path to ensure that she could find a stable job if her artistic dreams didn't work out. I understand this. It's a very Tamilian thing to do.
I was working in Singapore Airlines KrisFlyer call center at that time for 12-hour shifts, night shifts. I was 19 at the time, and my mom was sick for some years before that. Maybe from the time I was 14 or 13. She had breast cancer, and then she struggled with that for about 5 years. And then she got really ill, like it spread to all the organs, not just the breast. So then she had 2 more years after that. And those last 2 years, I stopped that job at Singapore Airlines call center and I just stopped to take care of her while my siblings were taking care of everything else, like the money and the administration of it all. I got really lucky with getting that opportunity. How many people get that chance to take care of your parent when they're ill? So I feel I got really lucky with that.
I'm deeply moved by Ruby's words, her perspective, her ability to frame the care of her mother as an opportunity, a gift life gave her. Because despite the way the words fall with ease, despite the small smile on her face, this couldn't have been easy. At just 19, she was faced with the reality of death, watching it unfold before her eyes. Ruby turned to dance, not just for solace and comfort, but as a way to accept this new reality, to accept the truth.
Even though I had to stop everything, I still went for dance classes here and there. And it was like a lot of emotions would come out when I'm there, because I was really taught to be, like by my mom as well, taught to be holding the emotion and don't let it go. And there's a time and place. And I felt like when she dies, I will break. But until then, I'm going to stay strong because I have to. I'm supporting her. I have to hold her if she breaks. But she almost never broke. I also held it together a lot. And when I did go for dance classes, it would just burst out sometimes. And my teacher would just say, just come and dance. I think that's why dance meant a lot to me as well. I think everyone experiences it differently. And for me, it was very much, no, it's not to separate and detach, but more that I do acknowledge where I am. But through this, what happens and what do we find became of interest to me. And sometimes it's not right there. Like you have to search for it or it takes some time. But yes, I think like when one path is closed or stops and some big shift happens, there are multiple things that open up too. It gives us access to some other things that maybe we did not have access to before this. After she passed away, I told myself I can let go now, like any emotions, any tears, any screaming, anything I need to do can come out now. But of course, it didn't come out when you bottle it for that long. At the funeral and all, I remember everything was behind this kind of rage, and I just couldn't soften myself or let it go. I just bottled up a lot of the emotions.
After her mother's passing, Ruby found herself stuck, emotionally bottled up, unable to let go, to move on from those years of her life. I can imagine that this is a hard place to be when you're an artist, a dancer, when expression and freedom are at the heart of what you do. For months, she moved through life on autopilot, working a receptionist job in an insurance firm, volunteering in Thailand, traveling in and out of Phuket. She disconnected, met new people, discovered new spaces. Nature helped. It helped her heal. But it was a long journey, one that took almost 10 years.
So it just became a kind of excavation to find these spaces in my body to release as well. Can you handle it? Or what if the emotions come out and you just break apart into a million pieces somewhere randomly in the world? Like, who's going to pick you up? Those kind of worries were there. But I felt certain that this was the path because I don't want to be closed off like that. I realized that, no, actually, I want to be expressive. I want it to come out. If there is mad rage, let that rage come out and transform into something else that can be more resourceful to myself and the world. The point is to go on the journey, to not keep it within me and just try to endure it. But yeah, there was a freedom after my mom passed on. I also got estranged from my dad. So I was just completely untethered to the family. I was quite an adult when I was a kid already. Becoming an adult, it was the opposite, somehow inviting more play and love and things that didn't come so easily to me at that point.
I love how Ruby uses the word untethered to describe her feelings. Her mother has passed on. She's estranged from her father. Her anchor has been cut. And yet, in that very state, in that instability, there's also open water, unexplored horizons, a chance to create, and as an artist, to discover something new. At 23, Ruby makes a bold decision to leave Singapore and study Bharatanatyam at the Kalakshetra Foundation in Chennai. Discipline, tradition, unwavering dedication. These are all words, phrases used to describe Kalakshetra. And Ruby knew it would be a struggle, not just to master the classical dance form, but to navigate the delicate dance between the disciplined approach to learning and staying true to her free-spirited self.
I still did question a lot. I still did defy a lot. But I had come from such a free upbringing that it was really hard to fall into the kind of control that women especially had to be under. It was a time of duality. I think it always is for me in some ways. But at that time, it was just like love and hate at the same time. It was such an inspiring place to learn an art form. because literally nature all around, even though you're in Chennai, and just music everywhere, dance everywhere. You're hearing people talk about dance and music. I have to admit that I got really lucky with people and teachers who were really kind and weird and like me too. So they were a little offbeat, which helped, because in that space it was great to be with someone who was offbeat, because everyone is just asked to be exactly the same. And since I was a kid, I was told to and always reminded to honor how different we are. Like my hair, for example. Of course, in Indian families, you have so much of oiling and combing hair that, hurts almost because, when you have curly hair and then there's so much like tangles that it hurts to literally do that, right? So I also grew up like that with a grandmother who was trying to straighten my hair out with oil and tied like two plaits. But I found it very easy to just break out of the two because of my parents. They were always quite like, whatever you are, be yourself and be the best at whatever that is, like the best version of yourself. But there was no rigidity that you have to be this girl with the plaited hair. So it helped me very easily just break out of that and not care about my hair and just do it the way I wanted to. But going back to Kalachita it felt a little scary, because it was almost like, okay, once again, I'm asking now for someone to tell me how to do my hair.
After leaving Kalakshetra, Ruby still didn't see a clear path forward. Singapore felt too expensive for her, and without her mother, her father, did it really hold space for her? She began to explore artists' residencies in Europe, bartering skills and paying when she could. These spaces offered her the chance to live, create, and collaborate with other artistic explorers. Here, Ruby discovered new forms of movement. She was already practicing yoga, but she included somatic practices as well. It was here that there was also a reshaping of her approach to Bharatanatyam and her understanding of the classical dance form.
By that point, I knew I was not going to do it traditionally the way I was taught. I felt like what it stood for, the history of colonization, all of that was starting to also really creep into my psyche. When I say colonization, I mean that the first level of colonization, which is that when a form is in our body, that is a level of colonization already, right? There is this technique, there is this thing that is placed on me that now I shall try to abide by.
I need to pause while I'm editing this and really think about what she's saying. What Ruby is reflecting on is how Bharatanatyam, or any structured dance form, imposes a system, rules, traditions, rights and wrongs, imposes that on the body. Ruby sees this as an act of taking on something that doesn't inherently belong to you. In other words, a form of colonization.
But with Bharatanatyam, as with other Indian dance forms, the history is the literal colonization of the British, who changed the form in some ways and let it only be shown in certain ways, and also the colonization of the higher caste taking the form from the lower caste. So Kalakshetra was opened up by Rukmini Devi and then her husband George Arundel as a kind of response after independence, where pre-independence there were people who were practicing like Devadasis, right, in temples and all, and it was under your lineage if you receive this form and then you have it. But Rukmini Devi was a high caste privileged person who got access to this form at a later time in her life, in her 20s, I believe, and just started teaching it to kids under this tree, and it just became this school eventually. She had a lot of experience with her husband being an older white man and a lot of experience traveling. So she had seen ballerinas doing ensemble work. So what she did with Kalakshetra was bringing that in here, where Bharatanatyam was performed as a solo dance form. She made it such that 8 or 10 women doing the same move, and how do we all coordinate and do that perfectly like ballerinas would in the Western theatre. She made it clean, because the British were not allowing Devadasis to be, because they were considered prostitutes essentially.
For those who are unaware, Devdasis were women dedicated to the service of temples and the gods of those temples.
These women were highly skilled artists and performed rituals, maintained temple traditions, and were custodians of classical dance, music, and Tamil and Sanskrit literature. Bharatanatyam in its earliest form was devotion, it was bhakti. But over time, things changed. Many of these women were forced to do sexual favors to priests and even local rulers. They were often labeled as prostitutes, and the shadow of this narrative fell on Bharatanatyam. And Rukmani Devi, with her Western influence, her upper caste lens, decided that Bharatanatyam needed to be saved.
So she reclaimed it, and then now it was acceptable, and it slowly became just a higher class activity when it was actually, to begin with, people of the lower caste who had this craft. And now it's come to a point where this Kalakshetra style of doing it, for example, which is the way I was taught to, is high level. And then some other ways are considered low levels, which just doesn't seem fair to me. And I did fall in love with the art form, but I also feel like I have had to open my eyes to what the art form really is, what its history is.
Critics call this the Sanskritization of Bharatanatyam, restricting it to certain castes, upper castes. It was also a sanitization, removing sensuality, sexuality from movements and costumes. So sure, Rukmani elevated the dance from temple floors to prestigious stages all around the world, but in doing so, she erased the contributions of the Devdasis who created, preserved, and dedicated their lives to this art. There's something else I'm interested in hearing Ruby's thoughts on, the patriarchal tone of these stories. For those unfamiliar, many of these classical dances tell stories about Hindu mythology and often depict women as devoted, self-sacrificing, passive. Think of Sita and Radha. While the men are the heroes and gods and even playboys, like Krishna. I asked Ruby for her thoughts.
I do think a lot of stories are very patriarchal, and so many characters do things that you feel like, why would a story be encouraging this? But that's the thing, I think, with Hinduism and these mythologies that we go with. It's not that a human is always a human. It's not so direct. There's a lot of it that is many layers, like what we do in Bharatanatyam as well. When we do a hand that is meant to express something, okay, now it's springtime and the sun is out, and I show that in my hands. The first one we do is always ner kai. You do it literally almost. And this is the sun, this is the flower, this is springtime, and it's coming out. But by the time you get to, you know how they repeat the lines, right? Like, let's say 4 times, 6 times. By the time you're at the 6th time, it is so away from the literal and so towards the abstract. So it becomes about the feeling and what the other things, where it's not about the flower and the sun, but more about you and your state at this moment. In this same way, I feel like it can be as literal as you want it to be, or as abstract, and it's just various parts of the spectrum that you choose to see. So I think the stories do have this kind of characters and this kind of embodiment, but I think it's worth looking at those things in different perspectives to find what we feel about it, more than what do I learn from this? Because I don't think they're all meant to be learned. I think they're meant to make you think, but not particularly learn that this is how it should be done. And yes, maybe the thing makes us angry that this particular character is so patriarchal and pushing his ways. But then what does that make you feel, and what irritates you about that you would like to change or create action within? Yeah.
Comes back to what you were saying about how India will show you the duality, right? And then it leaves you to find a way to deal with that.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And I think the stories as well are always like that, right? No one is one evil villain, full stop, or one great brave hero. Everyone, the hero does shitty things, and the villain does great, amazing things too, which is why they're all so human in that way, gods or demigods or whatever they are. And even if you just take it as a character in a story, it's still a very complex character which has a lot of depth, which I think is what all of us are, what we need to look at in each other and learn about, right?
The hero does shitty things, the villains do amazing things. This is what a masterclass from Martin Scorsese would teach you. Characters are multidimensional, never one-dimensional, and even gods with their divine attributes need to be brought down to earth with relatable flaws and emotions in order to make them memorable and timeless. Maybe that's why these stories are relevant even after thousands of years. But let's return to Ruby. She has spent her time at artist residencies in Europe, coming back to Singapore occasionally. What made her move back? Was it hard?
I have to admit, I don't think it was. I think it just flowed right into my path very well, where I didn't have to worry that much. And somehow the word of mouth started happening, and I just started working with one person and then another person, and it just flowed quite comfortably. And a lot of people were working in interdisciplinary work at the time. I think it was, just the right time where there were people who were interested to have artists of different crafts to come into their work and experiment and play and devise and find. I have to admit, I've never really felt like home is a place, be it Singapore, be it India, anywhere. It felt like people were the closest to home. The people I met wherever, they felt like home. And COVID also got me like staying here for a lot more. And it was almost like before this, I was like, had the privilege of just leaving. So I didn't have to be so involved in things here. It's almost like family. And I felt that way with Singapore as well, that now that I'm here, I just felt like so much more connected to many of the issues here, and I wanted to stay here. Whereas before this, I just be like, no, just go somewhere else. Just don't be a part of it. So now I feel a little more like when you're staying at home, then you see all the issues a lot more clearly and you want to be a part of it. So slowly it shifted for me. I still feel like home is everywhere, like one of the things I found helpful for me was that when you have nothing, you have everything. and the same as if you have nowhere, you have everywhere. Like everywhere becomes home almost, which is a very exciting thought to have or mindset to have.
When you have nothing, you have everything. When you have nowhere, you have everywhere. If this was a book I was reading, I would highlight this section. It would have been highlighted 1,000 times already, but it's so beautiful, I would highlight it as well. We move on in our conversation. I'm very interested in being Indian in Singapore, being the I in the CMIO. I know that being brown shapes so much of how the world sees me and how I see myself. So I asked Ruby what being brown, being Indian means in Singapore, this city that is so multicultural but far from colorblind.
It's very conflicting because it's almost like no space that I can fit in naturally, be it the Indian community or non-Indian community. It always was not the most comfortable and always a little conflicting because when I am in some spaces, I have my own thoughts about certain things. But when you are with people in society, you have to shift and code switch, and all of that is a little hard for me. I feel like the amount of the Indianness or Tamilness I am and all that it's very clear to me. But it seems like on the outside to a non-Indian or to an Indian, all these things, there are certain levels to hit or boxes that you have to fit in, which I just never could or didn't want to as well. I think it was just a challenge to accept us as we are as well, and to remind that we are not just this thing that you think I am, but also several other things. So it hasn't been the most comfortable ever in any space. I feel like always a bit of an outsider, but I got lucky with accepting the uniqueness, especially with my parents, and just honing that, like that individuality is what is special, and don't curb that. I accepted that this unique, weird thing is me. And I understand that people's perspective on me will be different, but that's not in my control. Of course, when I come out, I feel like now people will stare just because your hair is big and curly, and I'm not pulling it into a tight bun or using anything to curb it. It feels as if it's someone else's expectation of what these boxes are and what these labels are. It's not mine. So it's not in my control what anyone thinks or feels.
I'm reminded when Ruby talks about her story about her father seeing beauty in the imperfection of crooked teeth. She continues sharing how she embraces this imperfection, her own imperfection, in her own creation process.
I did this work called the ballet. It was a performance and then a film. That work was about mental illness, which is something that I struggle with. And it was at a time where there was a growing anxiety of COVID. So that work became very much about anxieties in the body.
Is anxiety what you struggle with?
Anxiety is something I struggle with, but only of lately, of the last few years. I struggled with depression for a long time, like since a teenager. And then in the last few years, I really had to give space to my inner world. It was just coming up so much. And I was also diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. I was on some psychiatric medicine and it was really a tough process. Thankfully, I'm off of it now and feeling better. But for some years in between, it was really hard. And that work became a kind of, I don't even know how to explain how it happened. It was so organic. It was just like I recognized that there were different facets of my personality that was coming out at different times, depending on the anxiety. So I created embodiment for them, just slowly building and building. And I didn't even know if it was going to be shown or it was more like a practice for me. I don't know what to do with this, so I'm going to try to figure it out through movement. And eventually it became a performance and a work.
On her YouTube channel, Ruby has introduced this work of art in this way. I'm crazy. Everything is a trigger. I switch between a spirit, lover, and warrior. Medication helps, I think. My mental patterns are upside down. But the thing about patterns is that they look crazy even when they're right side up, I think. I've shared a link to this performance in the notes, and if you watch it, you'll see Ruby wearing a long flowing skirt. She embodies the music in her movements. Her skirt sometimes flows over her legs and sometimes over her head. What is right side up? What is upside down? What does it mean? Does it mean? Even on YouTube, it's a raw and impactful performance, one that she says altered her approach to everything.
At that time, when I did that work, it also made me understand that I wasn't a dancer, I was an artist. I realized when I danced that I couldn't be a dancer. I couldn't just fall in and learn the choreography and just do it the way it was. I had too many questions, too many things I had to say, too many conversations that I wanted to pull out to just do the dance. It was the art and the artwork that I care about. It was about the integrity of the work. I also felt like I realized what the life of the work on its own has and how much I push or pull, it still grows. It does its own way. It's like a plant. Yes, you can do things to help and nourish and pull at the right things and push at the right things. But once it is there and it's going to grow on its own, that was one of the works that I think made me also realize and understand to flow with things and give the work the life that it is and let it live, as opposed to pulling and pushing so much and pushing it into spaces that maybe it doesn't quite need to be in at that moment, and move away from the ideas of entertainment and aesthetics and bring it to spaces that is maybe a bit more new, just new spaces to be in for us to perceive it differently.
As our conversation comes to a close, I want to ask Ruby about The Brown Box, the name of the podcast, The Brown Box, which comes from a deeply personal space. It's a reflection on the ways I have been categorized, labeled, and confined to a box. The idea of this name came from the simple act of filling out a visa form, or maybe it was a job application and ticking the box Indian. In that moment, what should have been a straightforward declaration of identity, even pride, left me feeling heavy with hesitation. What would it mean to tick that box and declare myself Indian? Would it affect my chances at a job, an interview, or even a visa? What prejudice or discrimination would emerge from this act of ticking this box? What definitions, what cliches would be assigned to me? Hence the name of the podcast, The Brown Box. I asked Ruby about boxes.
I think it's first about just seeing what box we are in, just recognizing and opening our eyes to those boxes. Because as simple as that sounds, I think it's not always easy to do. Just knowing what boxes we are in and what boxes we chose to walk into with autonomy and what we were squeezed into by someone else and don't want to be in or don't want to identify with that, but still we're put into those boxes. I think just being aware of those boxes is the start to then deciding if you want to be in that box, outside or adjacent or whatever that is. But personally, I do feel like fuck the boxes. I feel like there are just so many around. There's just too many around. I personally do think I am not just that box. Even if I was inside, I'm also several other boxes and many other spaces outside that are not trapped into a box. So it's not fair to just put that one box or one label and decide or figure out what this person is. Because it's, if anything, we know it's that everyone is a multitude of things and it's just not as interesting to simplify it and reduce it to just that. And if we don't, I feel like there's a lot more spaces for us to inhabit, like for us to share when we don't have these boxes, because then the abyss becomes another animal of its own when you're outside, and this can give you new things that you didn't expect. Yeah.
That's really beautiful. That's really nicely said.
As I edit this, I feel a little emotional. I've had these thoughts, but never been able to articulate them in such a beautiful way. Knowing what boxes you're in, what boxes you choose to walk into, and what boxes you're squeezed into. Those words are going to stay with me. My final question, what advice would Ruby give to young artists beginning on their journey?
Firstly, I think they should just do it. Like the first step is just that if there's a part of you that wants that, to just take the leap, try. The worst case scenario is that you fail and have to do something else, which is fine. You'll do that anyway. But I feel like, especially in Singapore, there's just such a fear to do this full time, to be an artist full time, to trust that you can make a living out of this, that it just drives people away, that capitalism of it all. I feel like it's almost like swimming. Just go into the water and then trap for as long as you need to, if that's what you need to. But until you go into the water, you wouldn't know how it feels. And then you realize what you want to do in the water or step out of it. It takes as much courage to not do it as to do it. So why not do it with the courage?
It takes as much courage to do it as to not do it.
Yeah.
Because if you don't do it, also you're making a hard choice.
Exactly. I feel like it's far harder not to do the work than to do it, because when you don't do it, you will never know what happens of it. It is then never fulfilled in some way, so you'll never get to experience that. And that inability feels really hard for me to accept, as hard as doing the work completely and committing to it. It's all hard. So that's what I'm saying, that I feel like it's to do or not to do, it's all hard. I feel like it's not the worst thing that can happen to fail at something. It has so many things to teach you. So what I'm trying to say is the worst circumstance can also be a very interesting teaching experience and then give you new journeys to take.
But you won't know until you try.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's a really beautiful place for us to end. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story. As I finish editing this episode, I'm drawn back to, yes, those vibrant patchwork pants. Such a beautiful metaphor for the tapestry of Ruby's life. There's been joy and pain, movement, both structured and free, travel, both inward and outward, an embrace of the perfect and the imperfect, a heart both hard and soft, a journey of holding on and then letting go. And in all of this kaleidoscope of experience, emerges this beautiful artist, Ruby Jayaseelan. Some moments from our conversation linger. Her father's appreciation of the charm of crooked teeth, teaching her to embrace imperfections. Her simple philosophy, so you fail, so what? Her decision to be an artist, not just a performer. Her joy in caring for her dying mother. And her ability to soften, not harden, in the face of life's challenges. I'm so grateful to Ruby for sharing her story, and to you for listening. Thank you for joining me on The Brown Box. Until next time, this is your host, Rani Jairaj, reminding you to embrace your crooked teeth, if you have them, and the patchwork of life that make up your one-of-a-kind journey. See you next time, right here on The Brown Box.